Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to this webinar presentation on art history in Bolivia today, a discussion. I am Dr. Winston Moore, Chairman of the Anglo-Bolivian Society in London, which this year celebrates its 30th anniversary. Today we have the special honor of welcoming Professor Pedro Querejazu, Bolivian art historian, conservator, restorer, and cultural manager, whose expertise covers colonial South Andean art, Bolivian contemporary art, and historical photography. Joining us for the dialogue with Professor Querejazu, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Valeria Paz, academic coordinator and advisor in the Department of Culture at the Universidad Católica Boliviana in La Paz. The interview will cover Professor Querejazu's personal experience in the field of art history in Bolivia, and he has published 14 books and numerous articles, including his monumental Pintura Boliviana del siglo XX. I would like now to present you Professor Querejazu, Dr. Valeria Paz, and Dr. Kate Ford, co-chair of the Anglo-Bolivian Society, who will formally lead this webinar. We have Alberto Subiron, our Digital and Communications Secretary, who will moderate the meeting. Thank you very much.
Hello, well, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon again. And I would just like to repeat more or less what Winston has said about what a pleasure it is to have Pedro and Valeria with us. Pedro's career spans 50 years and almost as many different aspects of art and the history of art. And Valeria, who PhD was from the University of Essex and who is currently researching mestizo and indigenous issues in Bolivian modern and contemporary art. And they are going to talk about Pedro's long, much lauded career in the fields of scholarship, research, conservation, restoration, curatorship, arts management, authorship, and editorship. His interests range from the colonial masters to cutting-edge contemporary work, taking in photography and architecture on the way. And two of his most monumental achievements are Pintura Boliviana del siglo XX, which Winston mentioned. Also, what was very important for me, Las Misiones Jesuíticas de Chiquitos. Each is a milestone in its field. And I weighed my copy of the Misiones volume, and it's almost 4.5 kilograms. Just why is the history of art so important? It's very simple. Art is fundamental to a country's identity, and the history of art explains that identity. Asked about the then situation of Bolivian art in 1998, Professor Querejazu made the following perceptive and timeless comment. Art today, 1998, manifests what is happening: the end of the millennium, globalization, the absence of utopias, the identities that seek to define themselves, the realization that it's impossible to define a Bolivian identity, given that the picture is of many identities. In that sense, Bolivian art is fully alive. And if there's a crisis, it could be that it is a societal one, and art is simply reflecting it. We are delighted that Pedro and Valeria are sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. Alberto has explained about the questions, and I now hand over to our speakers. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. Good evening to those in London. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Anglo-Bolivian Society, to Winston, Kate, and Alberto. And I'm very happy to be here also and say hi to friends in London and in La Paz who are following us. It's my pleasure and it's an honor to do this interview to Pedro Querejazu, from whose work I have learned and with whom I have worked. I will start. I don't know if you would like to say a few words, Pedro, before we start this conversation that we have decided will be in an interview format.
Just to say thank you for your invitation, your kindness of thinking of me as a contributor to the art history in Bolivia. Thank you.
Okay. As Kate and Winston have mentioned, Pedro has worked as conservator and restorer, cataloger also, cultural manager, curator, editor, academic, researcher, and professor in public institutions and cultural foundations in Bolivia from the 1970s to today. These are 50 years in what I consider generally adverse conditions in economic, social, and political terms for culture and the arts. So it's so his work spans from the 50s, in fact, 70s, 80s, and 90s to the 2000s. If we count the first part when he studied art at the Fine Arts Academy in Sucre. Pedro, I believe Pedro is a pioneering protagonist in each of these different activities in Bolivia. To learn and talk about his professional activities, conservation, curatorship, academic, etc. From 1962, when he still was a teenager, to 1966, is a unique opportunity to gain insight into the history, situation, conditions, perspective, and changes in the history of art in Bolivia from the 60s to the present. So let's start with the questions. Pedro, this is the first question. You studied, as I mentioned, fine arts in Escuela de Artes Aplicadas Zacarías Benavides of Sucre, the Fine Arts Academy, while at the same time you were completing your secondary education. While studying fine arts, you decided and you declared that you were not an artist and that you were not going to be an artist. Can you please explain why and to what extent the view of the time of art or what you learned at the academy influenced this decision?
Okay.
And
well,
yeah.
My father thought that I was able to drawing and painting, so he put me in the fine arts school in Sucre when I was 11 years old. In those years, it was possible to study fine arts at that age. So I coursed 6 years from the 4 regular academic years until 1966. I think they thought I could be an artist, and at the same time, I think they were worried about me being an artist. The problem was for me that when I finished the studies, I realized that I was not an artist. For me, the white canvas was a terrible situation. What to put in a canvas, what to put in a page of paper. Then I decided I had to do something else. My professor, Jorge Urioste, suggested that although I was already very capable and very well prepared to be an artist, that could try conservation and restoration of works of art. So that was an enlightening idea, and I went to Spain to study conservation and restoration of paintings. I did the full career in Spain in 3 years. But the curious thing is I made the fine arts school at the same time I was making doing the high school. So I graduated the same month from fine arts and from high school. Then I went to Spain. You can see when I was in Sucre, according to these photographs, Sucre was a very small city, 20,000 inhabitants, very scarce conditions. I studied history of art with my professor, Jorge Urioste, from books. There was no projectors, not screens, not PowerPoints, not anything, not computers, not very good books. So I studied from plates in the books and learned how to paint, drawing, sculpture, and watercolor. And I became a very good watercolor painter. But I wasn't, I didn't feel like an artist. That's it. Maybe in the next image you could see, that was my school, Academia de Bellas Artes, painted by Victor Arce Góngora, people from Cochabamba that studied there also. In the next image, I present my professors, Jorge Urioste, Enrique Balda, Nanette Zamora, and Josefina Reynolds. 4 of them were students from Juan Rimsa. Next. Jorge Urioste, the one in the left upper corner, studied also in Chile. And he was my mentor during the 6 years in the school. You can see him, Jorge, Enrique Balda at the left down side, Nanette Zamora, and Josefina Reynolds, painted by Juan Rimsa. When I left the school, I went to Spain. Next, I guess.
Okay, going back. Let's go back. Okay, so I was wondering, so when you studied in the Art Academy in Sucre between 1962 and 66, I think, well, abstract art and conceptual art were, let's say, the main, well, not yet conceptual, but neo-Dada art was the new trends, and abstract art since the 50s. But what you showed us about the teachers, your teachers at the Art Academy, is mainly figurative art. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the view of art in Bolivia at the time, particularly at the Art Academy, and if at that moment, did you have any information on the art history of Bolivia?
No. By the time I studied fine arts in Sucre, there was it was in the wake of the great masters from Sucre, Gili Maná, Jorge Maná, Walter Solón, Lord Hubaca, who studied there, and Guillermo Frankovich, that was the dean of the university, and a group of poets and writers that worked together in the Grupo Anteo. The Academy was following that wake of the figurative art with the influence of indigenism and expressionism. But by the time I studied, nobody talked about abstract art, conceptual art that was in its prime at this moment, or Dada or surrealist art. It was mentioned sometimes by my professors, but nobody talked and worked in that way.
Okay, thank you. And very differently from La Paz, I think, no, as well? In the 60s?
Not so much. But because by the 60s in La Paz, where Arnal, well, there was the abstract group with Maria Luisa Pacheco, La Placa, Armando Pacheco, and so, but Alandi was also working here in La Paz, and Solon they came to live in La Paz. So there was two sides of the socialist painting in figurative art, and the abstract and formalist art by the abstract painters, and something in between with Arnal and people and Montes that were starting their careers in those years.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is talked about Bolivian art history, but about that time.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned you studied conservation and restoration at the Escuela de Artes Aplicadas a la Restauración, which is now part of Universidad Complutense in Madrid, between 1967 and 1969. I assume that during that time you studied also art history, and that there was a prevailing view of art and related disciplines in Spain at the time. I was wondering if that had an impact on yourself, and can you tell us retrospectively what was the influence and who were your mentors and professors?
Okay. Well, by the time I was studying in Spain, conservation, it was focused in conservation of, obviously, in the great masters in the past art, in the art of the past. So I learned to see and to touch and to study pieces by Velázquez, by Zurbarán, by Murillo, and other painters. And I was not interested by then in contemporary art. My training was in conservation of works of art. And the classes at that time were only 4 hours a day. So as I had a full day devoted to that, I passed the 4 hours of classes, but at the same time, I joined the analysis laboratory. I worked with the photographer as volunteer, and a lot of time studying art. My main professor was Matías Díaz Padrón. He was professor at the Escuela de Restauración that worked in the Casón del Buen Retiro by those years. And we, every day we had history of classes in the Prado Museum. And Matías took a group of 4 to 6 our classmates to classes every day, 1 hour, 2 hours in the Prado Museum. And he taught how to see, how to study, how to learn the peculiarities of the art. So I developed a keen eye to watch the differences, to appreciate the differences in the style, in the paint strokes and materials. And besides that, I was learning in the conservation training area. It was a real privilege to go through 3 years of classes in the Prado Museum every day. We also visited some other museums as the Lázaro Galdiano and to see the collections of modern paintings at Joaquín Sorolla. But the main focus in the conservation of works of art then in Spain was the great masters of the Baroque, Velázquez, Zurbarán, or the masters of the Renaissance, like Berruguete, Juan de Juanes, etc. So I learned how to treat and how to see, how to study pieces made in wood or in canvas, and how every painter. And I also we also studied Van Dijks and Rubens in the Prado Museum, and other painters as Goya in the later period. I had an uncle, Alfonso Querejazu, in La Paz, in Madrid, who thought I should study history of art. But by those years, I was just focused on conservation of works of art. But I learned a lot from them, from my studies in this career.
Thank you. Would you say that your approach to art and art history, but also to art history, it was then one more of a connoisseurship? By
Yes.
that, yes, no? One
Yes.
Specializing in technique, style, identifying an original from a forgery, etc., right?
That's it, precisely, that's it.
Okay, thank you. So continuing, in 1969, you returned to Bolivia, first to Sucre, where your hometown, where you hope to work in restoration, but weren't able to, and then to La Paz, where you were invited to work at the National Museum of Arts, and you were its first conservator between 1970 and 1973, correct?
Yeah, that's true. I must say that while I was studying my second year in Madrid, I met, they looked for me, José de Mesa and Teresa Gilbert, that were cultural attachés at the Bolivian Embassy in Madrid. Mr. Professor Diego Angulo knew about me. He followed my footsteps in Madrid, my studies in the Diego Velázquez Institute late in the evenings until 9 in the evenings. So he was aware of me and my studies and my progress in conservation, and he recommended me to Mesa and Gilbert. They proposed me to work in Bolivia. And I accepted that proposal. In fact, when I finished the career of conservation, I was invited by Don Diego Angulo to work with my classmates in the Prado Museum, but as conservators, but I opted to coming back to Bolivia. I thought that by then that I owed myself to Bolivia. I tried to find work in Sucre at the university in the Charca Museum, but there were no good conditions. There were no laboral options. There were no all doors were closed, so it was not possible. So I came to La Paz, and I knew some other people. It was the Alfredo Bando government, a military government. And I guess liaisons from my mother and the wife of Obando managed to open me a door. So I was appointed conservator of the National Museum of Art, a new post of new creation. It was, I was named by Carlos Rosso, who at the same time named Teresa Gisbert as the director of the National Museum of Art. So she and me both started our jobs in February 1970. And I started working with her, obviously, but I devoted my work to create a workshop in conservation in the museum that there was not anyone previously. So that was my first start.
Thank you. Just a note to everyone who might not know, Jose de Mesa and Teresa Gisbert were a couple, art historians, the first art historians who also studied art history in Madrid. They were very influential. They have also cataloged a large part of Bolivian colonial art and done a lot of research in Bolivia. Just a short note, but going back to what we were talking about. So 1970, you start working in La Paz at the National Museum of Art. These were very convoluted times. What was the general condition of art history, and conservation in Bolivia at the time? Did you share like the same view as Jose de Mesa and Teresa Gisbert at the institution? Well, in this case, only Teresa, no? Because not Jose was.
Well, but those years I was not thinking of history of art. I was just thinking on conservation of works of art. And I started, I prepared and I implemented a laboratory of conservation in the museum with very scarce conditions. And I started to restore paintings from the museum. And at the same time, I was invited by Jose de Mesa to teach in the Escuela de Arte, in la Carrera de Artes Plásticas in the university in La Paz. So the teaching and the making conservation was the very beginning of my, the opening of my career in the professional field. One of my students then became a collaborator, Mary Tapia, in the museum. And then I met some artists at the school, like Enrique Arnal and Marister Valdivian. But I focused my job in making helping in the catalogation of the museum. I helped in the museography of the museum, but mainly I was doing conservation of works of art.
Okay, thank you. But let's say, what were the main focus of conservation and cataloging at the time? What did Bolivian art look like at the museum at the time? What were its collections? What were its priorities?
Well, you asked me before what was happening with art history in Bolivia. Well, there were some historians that made history of art in the previous decades, but it was in the 70s that the Mesa and Gisbert were still working on that subjects. In 1972, they published the Escultura Virreinal in Bolivia, and in 1977 published the Holguín and Pintura Bienal in Bolivia. The second edition, the first one had been the 1956, I guess. So they were learning and producing books on knowledge and colonial art. And I just was restoring those pieces. And the main collection of the National Museum of Art that was created in 1966 by President Paz Estensoro and José de Mesa and Teresa restored the building of the Casa Díez de Medina, which is now the Museo Nacional de Arte. The main collection had been gathered by people from Potosí, mainly Armando Alba and others, and it was already known as the Colección Melchor Pérez Holguín, the property of the central bank, Banco Central de Bolivia, and that was lent to the museum. There were Holguines, Berrios, things like that in the very fine pieces indeed in that collection, but also there were some contemporary art collections, pieces by Arnal, by Lord Hubaca, by Solon, and Teresa Hilbert organized two main exhibitions, the colonial art and the contemporary art, the Bolivian contemporary art. And I did conservation of furniture and sculptures and paintings to open new exhibition rooms in the museum.
Okay, thank you. So basically the collection was made of colonial art, furniture, and contemporary art. All
Yes.
of them were donations. I imagine there was no funding for acquisitions. So
Not at all.
the collection was determined by what? But by the donations, right?
Mainly by the donation, because the museum didn't have any budget, only for personnel that depended on the Ministry of Culture, and we didn't have even a budget to pay the light, the powers, the water, and so with the tickets from visitors, we paid the bills of power, water. We didn't, at the beginning, the museum didn't have any telephone line, landline.
How many people worked at the museum?
We were 7 people.
Okay. All right.
Mostly
Thank you.
guards, one a keeper of the museum, a guard by night, guides, a secretary, a conservator, and a director.
Mhm. Thank you. Okay, so that was how the 70s looked at the museum,
Yeah.
the National Museum of Art. Small, and this is the most important institution, public institution for national art of all from all the periods. Anyway, my next question is from 1974 to 1978. You worked under the leadership of art historian José de Mesa as a UNESCO expert, a project that was key in the restoration, conservation, and transformation of the city of Cusco as a cultural and touristic city that we know today. Can you tell us a little bit about how this experience impacted your view of art and your work in art history? And here we have some slides. We can move a little bit forward.
Yes, of course. Well, I was working in the museum, and casually I went to Lima to propose my wife that was studying in Lima by then. And I met Jose Correa Orbegoso. He was the director of the conservation, World Heritage Conservation in Peru. And he was very close friend with José de Mesa. They had worked in Trujillo. So he knew me, and we talked. He helped me to make some photographs for José de Mesa around the work of Alessio. And but those years, in 1972, the Peruvian government requested funding from the World Bank to develop the regions of Puno and Cusco that were greatly depressed in those years through cultural tourism. So it was necessary to do a lot of conservation of works of monuments, works of art, etc. So they got a loan from the World Bank of $66 million. 6 of those were devoted along 5 years to the conservation of works of art. So the Peruvian government made an agreement with UNESCO and created a project that was called COPESCO, and a sub-project that was Per 39 from UNESCO. So I was contracted by UNESCO to teach conservation to Peruvian restorers, to help to prepare the projects for conservation of monuments and works of art. And it was at the beginning 1 year and a half contract that it was extended to almost 5 years. In those years, I taught conservation of works of art to about a group of 30 conservators, Peruvian conservators on works of art, mainly in sculpture and wooden object. That was the theme I was contracted for. There was a Spaniard contracted for conservation of paintings, people from Yugoslavia to conservation in archaeological materials, and so on. There were archaeologists, architects, and a bunch of people. At a point, we were 7 UNESCO experts working together in a multidisciplinary way. In those years, the main achievement I did, it was the conservation of 5 wooden covered ceilings in the Palacio De La Meranti. We are looking at the images. When I reached to Cusco with my wife, the Palacio De La Meranti was in ruins. It had suffered from the 1950 earthquake in Cusco. But in those years, conservation was to put down the building and build it again, supposedly in the same way, instead of conserving what was still in its foots. So when I reached to the Palacio de Almirante, it was ruins. We left the museum, the palace in 1978, as you can see in the lower right image, fully restored and with the 5 covered wooden ceilings that were scattered around the city. We gathered the pieces and we rebuilt the pieces. Maybe the next image will show you that. Next, Alberto.
To the next, yes.
So those are some examples. There were 5. They are showing parts of 2 of them. The most completed one in the left, and the less complete one that had to be rebuilt completely, starting from 3 pieces in a photograph in the right. It took 4 years of work, and I made also some other pieces in conservation of sculpture mainly, and paintings. Maybe in the next image. The main piece was the San Cristobal. It was a huge piece of 2.5 meters made on maguey, pasta, and glued cloth by a sculptor in Felipe Maita in around the mid-17th century. The piece was badly damaged with the years, and they changed the fashion. It was uncovered, but behind it was about to fail. So we made a conservation and a restoration work that we can see in the next image. That was the face of this beautiful face with glass, eyes made of glass, real tooth, mirrors in the throat, and the very realistic sculpture of the Baroque period. Next, maybe. And that was the piece as we finished the restoration. From 1 year to another, this is one of the pieces that go in the procession of Corpus Christi from the San Cristobal. In the left one, you see the pieces we restored in the previous day of Corpus Christi, and people of the parish wanted it to be covered with a chaleco, with a cope. So it was promenaded, as you see in the right image.
So this image was in the palace?
No, this image was in the church of San Cristobal.
Okay.
And the people from the church asked us from the project Pedro to help us to conserve the piece. So we did it along 1 year after one Corpus Christi feast in 1974 until the previous days of Corpus Christi in 1975.
Okay, so I just would like to point that, I mean, these are major works in Cusco. The palace was first the house of Pizarro, right? And also of the viceroyal authorities. It's very, very important building in Cusco.
And, another time I worked there, the school of Inca students. The sons of the Incas were taught in that house by Jesuits.
Okay, great, very interesting. And in this, and this also, I think this, I mean, this is also a very important piece because it was done in maguey, which is a technique of a plant in the Americas. I would assume, but you can correct me, that this was done by an indigenous artist or not, and we know who it was made by?
Yeah. This is an Andean technique of sculpture, the maguey and glued cloth with pasta. Well, sculptors in Spain knew how to use cloth to make sketches for the sculpture, but it was transformed, and Beatty and Vargas almost created the technique using cloths to make sculpture. And the Indians put the maguey, that is something that is very common in the Andean region, and the sculpture is an Indian sculpture, Felipe Huamanmaita, very well known in Cusco in the mid-17th century.
Okay, thank you. Can we move forward, please, with the images? As you can see, I think, well, here are some of the works that you restored. And as I mentioned, they are emblematic pieces of not only of art from Cusco, but of the region, like this Madonna of Beatty. I don't know, I mean, we can, if you want to comment quickly while we move past each image.
Yeah, well, this was a piece in the cathedral but later, it was given to the Spanish conservator to restore, but he didn't manage to do it. So when he left and finished his contract, I was given the piece to restore. So I tried to restore and I make X-rays, very different kind of studies. The piece had suffered a lot of overpaintings, but we managed to restore it to its original conditions that you might see in the right hand image. The left hand was the state before conservation. And later I made some other pieces in Cusco and in other places like in Argentina and in Bolivia, of course. Maybe the next one.
Yeah, I wanted to ask something about the previous one.
Yes, please.
Yes, Beatty was a European artist, no Italian,
Italian artist, yes.
And he had European technique, and then you mentioned that it was a Spanish restorateur. That he didn't. Was it because he couldn't restore it to its original condition or image? Is it because it was another technique, a different technique that was used in this piece? Or
well,
what did you find?
It's hard for me to say that. I think he thought he would remain in Cusco forever. So he delayed the conservation and just didn't do the work during 1 year and a half. So the piece was sitting there while he was teaching. And so He obviously knew, as he was from Valencia, depending on wooden plates, and he was really capable of doing that, but he didn't do. So it was commended to me.
Okay, no, thank you. Let's continue then, maybe moving a little bit faster with the images, because I have a few more questions. If you want to say anything about this image.
Well, it happened that I restored some other pieces made by egg yolk and oil on wood, like this Madonna de Yavi that I made in Buenos Aires for the Fundación Tarea in 1991. It was badly cleaned and it was covered with smoke. So I restored it. You can see the difference in the above image and the lower images from what he was. I did. And I went to Buenos Aires to teach Argentinian conservators at the Tarea workshop to how to improve their knowledge in conservation of works of art. Also, I also made another piece that is in the show, the next one. This is one from the Moneda, another piece by Peter van Aalst, a Flemish painter from Aalst near Brussels. It was badly damaged. I restored the piece, as you can see. I put the wings that were lost, making an hypothetical conservation based on the background of the painting to fulfill and to show people in the museum that was a triptych, not a single piece as it reached over time. A Spanish-Flemish painter, very interesting piece, maybe in the next one. And in Cusco, I made the conservation of 5 pieces by Beatty that were different kind of works of art. Beatty was a painter, but he was commended in the late 16th century to make sculptures. So he's joining forces with a gilder, Pedro de Vargas, and learned the techniques from the Indians and made these several pieces for the Retablo de la Compañía in Cusco that were made on wooden planks and made with pasta and maguey. And the gilding was made by Pedro de Vargas. The pieces are very mannerist in their way, the Beatty style, but the technique was a creative solution. And this was this was very original, and that the study of those pieces was the origin of my first writing on conservation of works of art and the approach of history of art through the techniques of the Andean paintings and sculpture. Okay, next, yes. Well, this is a Beatty that I restored for the Cathedral de Sugre, and that went to an exhibition in Santiago de Compostela in 1993 that showed the mannerist style. And I also restored some pieces by Berrio, by Holguín, and there is a selection of pieces in this show showing Berrios, a very large piece, a very emblematic piece, the Archangel of Así el Tío Mordé in the National Museum of Art, some Holguines also, and mainly Luis Niño. That was, I had the chance to conserve and restore some pieces that showed light about this great painter that was more famous than Holguín in colonial period in Potosí. Also an indigenous painter, no? An indigenous painter. Arsán Rosui Vela, the great colonial historian, compared him to the great Greek painters, Apelles, Timantes, as the top quality painter in Potosí, active in Potosí.
Well, we can move forward. These are some of the Holguines, a very important artist whose very emblematic works you restored.
Yes.
We can move forward because I think there are more images of Holguines. Oh, okay.
That's a small list of the works my articles that I started to publish, studying the pieces from the techniques and the style. And that was my introduction to art history in the late 70s.
So you began working with colonial art because you
Yes.
started.
I never stopped at it also.
So and also Teresa Gisbert and Jose de Mesa also started with colonial art. So there was let's say that was the main area of focus of art history, just because, I mean, there were not many others working, and in your case, because that was a natural or organic development from your work, or
yes, the older one was Mario Chacon Torres in Potosí. That was an archivist, and he worked. He found a lot of documents of artists in Potosí. So with the documents, he went to the churches and to the museums and was working identifying pieces. Mesa and Teresa Gisbert also did the same thing about with the documents produced and translated and transcribed by Gunnar Mendoza in the National Archive in Sucre. So they could make the Bolivian art history based in the documents gathered by archivists.
Okay, can we move forward, please? The images.
I put some images of books in which I collaborated on colonial art, the Mudéjar. There are several main articles published in Spain and in England. Maybe the next one.
It's an exhibition in the US, the arts in Latin America. Can we move forward? And can we move back? Because there is one back. Ramon Gutierrez, did you mention that he was one of your mentors?
Yes. One thing that I learned when I was studying in Spain is that when you knew that somebody was making any research on any field, you couldn't, by ethics, do the same, touch the same field. As Jose de Mesa and Teresa were working in the colonial art, I was not able ethically to do the same thing. So my approach was about the techniques, the study of the techniques, the how-to those pieces were made. Later, Ramon Gutierrez invited me and another group to write on those subjects from my knowledge, and he coordinates several publications, and one of those is this one that was published in Italian by Jacob Book and by Editorial Nerea in Spain, with the collaboration of art historians from the whole of America. And that was one of my main learnings from Ramon Gutierrez, the work in a teamwork, rather than the personal work by Teresa and Gilbert, that were a couple that worked like an unity, an entity. So I tried to do that later in other projects.
Okay, great, thank you. Can we move forward, please? And forward, unless you want to mention something about this. This is an important exhibition in New York.
Yeah, this is an exhibition I coordinated. I was the curator with Elizabeth Ferrer. It was the Fundación BHN in La Paz, in which I worked, that proposed it. It was devoted to the promotion of Bolivian art, and we worked in the colonial field and the contemporary art field. So with Fernando Romero and the group of the Fundación, they managed to get a room in the American Society and a proposal for an exhibition. And as in America, the Peruvian art is very well known. We have to deal with a very peculiar subject, very Bolivian subject. It was Potosí. It was chosen as Potosí. So we deal with the School of Potosí. We gathered some people writing in this book, even Teresa and Jose de Mesa, and I curated the exhibition that was taken in the 1978 and 79 in New York. It was mentioned as the second most important exhibition in New York that year, after the Impressionists in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It caused a great impact, knowing that the Potosí, the colonial city of silver, had a very important art school also.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Can we move forward, please, with the images? Do you want to comment? Any comments?
Then later I published some books on cultural heritage, making more diffusion of what was made in this case in Potosí, in the conservation of monuments and works of art in Potosí, Plan de Rehabilitación de las Áreas Históricas de Potosí. It's a kind of report that was charged to, committed to the commitment of showing what was made during 20 years in Potosí. So I made photographs, I studied the pieces, and I put a catalog and an exhibition, a temporary and traveling exhibition on Potosí, also in conservation. And the next one is the one devoted to the Cathedral of Sugre, which is the most important cathedral in Bolivia, because it's from the 16th century. Main pieces are, the building is from the 16th and 17th century and has a very important collection of works of art.
Yes, well, this, both Potosí and Sucre are World Heritage Cities, are named by UNESCO. So this reminds me of that you also contributed to this naming by your work in restoration and art history. Just wanted to point
I hope so.
Hmm?
Well, I'll have to put the name in high level with my work, yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Can we continue, please?
By invitation of Ramon Gutierrez also, I worked with other groups on modern art and contemporary art, especially in this book that was coordinated by Aracia Amaral in Sao Paulo, Brazil, the colonial art. I wrote about the colonial art in Bolivia, neo-colonial art in Bolivia. The 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in Bolivia, in Potosí, Sucre, and La Paz, and even Santa Cruz.
Okay, great. So,
and I also wrote some other articles on contemporary architects like Juan Carlos Calderón and Gustavo Medeiros, invited by Ramon Gutierrez, in a book published in Mexico, Arquitectos Iberoamericanos Siglo XX. Another book, Architecture and Società, well, several books on modern and contemporary art. And some, the Atlas of Barroco for UNESCO, the Macmillan Publishers Dictionary of Art, and so. My last contribution to the contemporary art and religious art is this one, La Iglesia Católica y el Arte, 1880 to 2019, that was published last year. Part of a lecture book. And
Now,
those are books on contemporary art that are my projects, my personal projects. So
you have
my
a
main
very,
job.
yeah. You have many publications also. Then, so you focused first conservation of colonial arts, but not exclusively, and then you started working with 20th century art, and you have many. You curated retrospective exhibitions of La Placa, for instance, of La Placa. I think of. And then Hilimana as well. And can we move forward? Because I want to stop in these two important publications. So in 1989, you published Pintura Boliviana del Siglo XX. And this is, so this is after, working between 1974 and 78 in Cusco. You returned to Bolivia. I'm just mentioning the highlights, some highlights to understand your trajectory. And between 1982 to 1987, you were named director of the National Museum of Art. And this year, 1982, was the year of the final transition from military dictatorships into a democratic government. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that job and directing this public institution impacted your view on art, and then of and how it's materialized in this first important publication on Bolivian contemporary painting, please?
Okay, yeah, those things are quite related. Jose de Mase was the director of the Bolivian Institute of Culture in those years. And he appointed me in the first stage as an advisor to his office in the Instituto Boliviano de Cultura, and later in 1982, he appointed me as a director of the National Museum of Art, and I was in the post during 5 years. Precisely in those years, I started making the study of the new collection of contemporary art of the museum, opening new rooms. The conditions were very difficult, political and economical also. But at the same time, in those years, Barbara Duncan arrived to Bolivia. He was friends with Fernando Romero, that was owner of a large holding, part of the Grace Company, and she wanted to publish his thesis on art. So we prepared an exhibition. We helped to prepare an exhibition that was the Virgin and Angels, the colonial paintings in Bolivia and Peru, and I helped to organize that exhibition. Precisely in those years, when the pieces were requested, Teresa Gisbert and Fernando Cajías, that were director of the Instituto Boliviano de Cultura, said that it was not possible to export those pieces for that exhibition. And I said I could do the arrangements, the legal arrangements to export those pieces, and I organized the exhibit. So when we went to New York to open that exhibition in American Society in 1887, Fernando Romero went with the idea, together with the daughter of Maria Luisa Pacheco, that had died in 1982, about doing a book on Maria Luisa Pacheco. But Barbara Duncan suggested that it was necessary previously to prepare a book on the whole vision of the Bolivian contemporary art. So it was asked me to deal with the project. I started to making photographs, gathering information, And at that point, when I was started with this book in 1985, nobody was in charge of contemporary art in Bolivia. But I made the book, I collected the information, I gathered some pieces, and at the end, I did the writing of this book, and I coordinated the book. The book is my intellectual idea in how I organized the book, the authors, the collaborators, the indexes, the bibliography of contemporary art, and so. It was published in the 1989. It was paid by a bank, and it was at the 100th year of the bank that it was published, Banco Hipotecario Nacional. It took me 3 years to prepare the piece. It was in the years later, 20 years later, it was declared of one of the most important pieces of the Bolivian books in the 20th century. So when was organized the Biblioteca del Bicentenario, the idea of publishing 200 books for the bicentennial of Bolivia. 2 of my books were incorporated in the list. One was this Pintura Boliviana del siglo XX. But time has passed, and it was in the 2018 that was published. So I included in this book 3 decades of art that were not in the first edition. I included a lot of more of information. I separated and studied the Bolivian contemporary art of the 20th century from different approaches, including popular art, naive art, different movements, and even the facts like the Guerra del Chaco that was very important. So I separated and prepared some chapters in this book that grew greatly. The original idea was to make a kind of re-edition, a second edition, but the second edition is in fact a very different and new book, much greater in extension and with 3 times more images than the previous edition. And it was published in 2018, going to 2025. It took 2 years to produce this new second edition.
Yes, on the cover of the books, of both books, there are details of sort of abstract paintings of Maria Luisa Pacheco, no?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on why you chose that image for the first, for the edition of, and also for the edition of, for your reviewed edition of 2017.
Well, the idea of the birth of this book was as an homage to Maria Luisa Pacheco. So from the beginning, it was decided that in the cover there had to be a painting by Maria Luisa Pacheco. In the first edition, in the 1989, is a detail of a part of the large Tríptico Blanco, which is a kind of paintings in white with textures, but we degraded and the white to grays and to get a more interesting cover. In the second cover, in the 2018 edition, the cover is a detail of the piece that won for Maria Luisa Pacheco the Sao Paulo Bienal Prize in 1989. It's a detail also.
Yes, can you tell us about why in both cases you chose an image of Maria Luisa Pacheco?
The first one, the book was born trying to make a book on Maria Luisa Pacheco. So as Barbara Duncan suggested to Fernando Romero, we made this book before. I couldn't make I couldn't reach the goal to producing a book on Maria Luisa Pacheco, but the homage was there in the fachada, and so we kept that promise in the second cover.
Like the statement would be an implicit statement that still is one of the most important artists.
Yes.
Of Bolivian, no, that's yeah, that's what I wanted to get at. And wondering, going back to 1989, there weren't many publications on modern contemporary art in Bolivia, but in 1989, I don't know if just before or just after yours, Carlos Salazar Mostajo publishes Pintura Contemporánea en Bolivia. And in his book, he argues and claims a vision of art which is diametrically opposed to yours and to the sponsors of your book. What are your thoughts about his views and his position on art?
Okay. Well, the book you mentioned was published the same year, 1989. Carlos Salazar Mostajo was a rural teacher, rural professor, and he was a Trotsky follower. He was a leftist, of course, and he thought that the main and the most original pieces of Bolivian art were those made by the muralists of like Alandia, like Solon, like Gilimaná, especially Alandia, and that the abstract art was an alienated art. Well, I argued with him a lot because we had chances to talk and discuss history of art and other subjects on those years, because both were professors of the School of Fine Arts in La Paz. He, for example, had a different approach in art history teaching. He started from present and going backwards to the past. And I argued with him that that was an absurd, because we always have to go back further and back further. And that was quite better to start from the past, going forward to the present, more easily to understand for people, for students. And well, of course, I argued with him that according to a more modern and late 20th century, abstract painters were so alienated following the School of New York as the socialist painters following the School of Mexico. They both were following international trends, not what was the mentality in Bolivia in those years. Probably the mainstream was the Tendencia Nacional with Arnal and Montes and other painters. But that was a very large discussion, not only between Salazar and me, but it took decades before with the abstract movement, the socialist arts movement in La Paz in the 60s and 70s. So it was a different approach. Well, obviously, I was accused of alienating myself with the international movement of art, or the international view of art. And I argued that no, I was looking for my Bolivian artists that no matter if they were socialist or if they were abstract, they were dealing with Bolivian subjects, the mountains, the people, the suffering, of course, but the angst for ancestral knowledge and well, and that's the discussion between us. Nobody was doing history of contemporary art in Bolivia. Salazar and me were the only ones. The only previous person was Rigoberto Villarroel Claure, that more than a historian was a critic of art that published 3 books on the subject. And I don't know the critics that were Julio de la Vega and Armando Soriano, but they were critics of art rather than historians of art.
Okay, thank you. Regarding this revised edition, as you mentioned, I consider you introduce some substantial changes in comparison with the other one. And for instance, and it's also a very different time, no? When you present this second edition or revised edition, it's 2017. We had the first indigenous president, the pink tide or more. And I wonder in Latin America, I wonder, and I see that, I mean, there's a specific section on the Chaco War, also contemporary artists that address political issues are included, and also pre-Hispanic and indigenous artists. So I wonder if I assume that it makes me think that you changed a bit, or that your vision of art and art history changed a bit from 1989 to 2017. I wanted to ask you about that. Am I right, or do you disagree?
Yes, you are right. I was at the beginning, as I was not intended to write anything on that subject. I fulfilled a gap and I wrote some texts that are in the book. I wrote in five different texts that are in the first edition. I suppressed all of them but the first one. But I made a linear history of art, time linear history of art in the edition of 1989. But in the second edition, I tried to read the Bolivian art from different approaches. The popular art, the persistence and the intention of to look for the soul, in the soul searching that Bolivian artists were making, looking in the past, the colonial past, but the pre-Hispanic past, and the urban realities that are quite different from the pre-Hispanic of colonial art. So I included naive and other different approaches. And as my personal option, I emphasize in the newer generation of creative art in contemporary art rather than traditional art. My commitment was to present and to show and to study the creativity of the Bolivian artists in Bolivian or abroad, rather than following, well, I didn't try to deny anything, but I was not following any current of the political issues in the 2000s, better said.
Okay, thank you. Can we move forward a few images to the cover of Borda? Well, this is an important work you edited, and Kate mentioned it weighs, I don't know how much she said, but it's very large. It's like an encyclopedia almost of the Jesuit missions.
Well, that's a very interesting work I did. It took me 5 years to produce this book. It started with a collection of 20 photographs by Plácido Molina. He was a very important historian in Santa Cruz that had met, and he had knew and rediscovered the Jesuit mission of Chiquitos in the late 40s. Nobody believed him that there were such missions and such monuments. And he, when touching doors, knocking doors, during 20 years, to publish his photographs of the Misiones de Chiquitos. When I met him, by request of Fernando Romero from the Fundación VHN, I saw the 20 photos and I asked him to show me all the photographs. So finally, he showed me 4,800 photographs, 480 photographs. And they said that there was a huge treasure, a documentary treasure and an artistic treasure, a photographic history treasure. So I decided, and I was promoting him to do a book on those collection of photographs. So this book was born in that way. Later, as the subject had been growing, because UNESCO had declared the Misiones de Chiquitos as cultural heritage also, so we decided to include works by the historians like Alcides Parejas and Virgilio Suarez, include the work of Hans Roth, the restorer of those missions, and some anthropologists and other people that studied those missions, and gathered a compilation including the music that was being found and studied and reproduced in archives and in concerts. So this book was born, and that's why it took so long to produce it. And now it has also been included in the Biblioteca del Bicentenario de Bolivia. It's a large book, a heavy book. You can't read it in your hands. You have to put support to read the book. It's almost 5 kilos in weight.
Thank you. Can we move forward, please?
Yes.
So,
while working in the Fundación BHN, I started to produce other themes on contemporary Bolivian art and trying to promote young people. So I gathered a collection of drawings. I studied them. I put the colonial background on the history of the drawing in the colonial art period. I didn't want to deal at the moment with the pre-Hispanic drawing. I'm now preparing a second edition with the pre-Hispanic included here, and some other books in that line, Bolivian 20th century. With Patricia Tordar and Fundación ESART developed a collection of art devoted to young artists. We made a long list, but we only could produce 2, Guiomar Mesa and Keiko Gonzalez. Well, later the funding was scarce, so we couldn't follow up with the collection.
This is in the 2000s, no?
But some people looked for me for their help, so I produced a catalog on Yolanda Aguirre, and produced a book of Gilcawara Lieberman with her work, with her help.
Can we move forward, please? Okay, this is where I wanted to get at. In 2017, you also published the book Borda 1988 to 2017. This is your most extensive publication, 350 pages approximately, on any single Bolivian artist. I was wondering, why did you choose Arturo Borda as a subject of such an endeavor?
Well, it's a long and short history. I met in 1970 Hector Borda, the younger brother of Arturo Borda, and he lent a selection of the collection of Arturo Borda to Teresa Hitubet, that was the director. And we prepared and showed about 15 pieces of Borda in a permanent room in the National Museum of Art. Later, the collection was withdrawn from the museum, but when I was director of the museum in 1983, it was the centennial of Arturo Borda. And I decided that it was important and interesting to do a work of people so important and so rarely, so unknown also. So I started gathering information and photographing pieces made by Borda from 1983 on. At that time, I talked with a young historian that was also dealing with Borda. I proposed him to work together, and he told me that no, he was a Trotskyist, he couldn't work with somebody like me. So I decided to wait until he published his book and then made my own. He published his book in 2010. And it was a book on the history of the person, as Arturo Borda as a person. The author was Ronald Roa. Then I started to produce, I proposed to produce a book on Borda. The fact is also important to understand that I was working in cultural management in Bogota, and I realized of the importance of producing books on artists as a way to contract memory, social memory. So when I came back from Bogota after 5 years in Bogota, I decided to devote all my time to study and produce books on contemporary art. Part of those projects are the ones made with Patricio Tordoa and Fundación Es Art, and working once again with Fernando Romero. I proposed to him to work together to put a collection of the most important artists of the 20th century. One was Marina Núñez, other one was Maria Luisa Pacheco, other one was Cecilio Guzmán de Roja, and Borda. By the time Cecilia Baya had managed to produce the book on Maria Luisa Pacheco, so I step aside of that project, and I proposed to do a book on Marina Núñez del Prado. When we got with Fernando Romero the funding, I proposed to the Fundación Marina Núñez del Prado to do the book. We had previously consulted with them, so they told us no. There was some young people that was going to do the book on Marina. There is no book on Marina anymore by now. But then I will look at for Borda and from Guzmán. I met Iván Guzmán de Roja, the son of Cecilio Guzmán de Roja, and I proposed to do a book on his work. And he told me that there was already a book. Supposedly there is a book, unpublished book. So I put aside my proposal, and nobody was doing anything on Borda. So I decided to do something on Borda. By then, I had been around 20 years of gathering photographs of his work, so I decided to put everything together. And I managed to gather some 450 photographs of works, different works of art, of Borda, drawings, paintings, and different kinds. And I studied, of course, using the book by Ronald Roa, and I gathered some collaborators of Borda as literature author, because Borda is also the great author of the 20th centuries, according to the literary critics. He had published the book Loco. So we put together everything, and that was the book of Borda that I started to produce it in 2012, and we produced it until 2017.
Okay, thank you. So Maria Luisa Pacheco, Marina Núñez del Prado, Cecilio Guzmán de Rojas, and Borda would be the masters of modern Bolivian art, right?
Yes.
You plan.
Well, there are some other ones, but they are the most known, of course.
And the best known. Okay. And but in 1911, you were granted a Guggenheim Fellowship to study historic Bolivian photography from 1984 to 1940. Why this turn in interest, this interest in photography? Can you tell us a bit about that and about the results of this research, still unpublished?
Yeah, the point is, I mentioned before that that approach to the production, the intellectual production on history of art, that the respect of the works for others, I mentioned before, and the work of Jose de Mesa and the colonial art. And I couldn't do anything better than them. I approached I did my approach with the conservation and the study of the techniques and some articles, but it was a kind of a closed field, because Jose and Teresa still were working that field. You know, they work all the time together and signing the pieces all together, except some later pieces by Teresa Gisbert, like Textiles Andinos and Iconografía, Mitos Indígenas en el Arte. But, and the contemporary field was already fulfilled with those editions and the books I was producing. So talking with some friends like Ramon Gutierrez, he recommended to study the field of photography as an art and as a document. I started to produce, to look forward, to look for that area of the art, of the knowledge. And it was a kind of a link with the conservation work. I had been registering old photographs, gathering old photographs also. So I proposed a project to the Guggenheim. By then I had already published the book on in 2009, the book on Gismondi. By then I had published around 4 articles on photographers of the late 19th or early 20th century, like Max de Vargas in Bolivia, and other articles dealing with the subject. So after producing the Gismondi's book, I proposed that subject and have been writing on photography, and I produced articles and Roberto Gertzman and others also. And I working in a kind of puzzle, working in different artists, and I will put them together to accomplish the general history of the photography in Bolivia, starting from 1840 to 1940, just a century. I didn't want to deal with the contemporary photography because it's a very large universe. The first 100 years is also a very large universe, but now I'm working on that.
Thank you, thank you. It's a very also exciting project, I think. And I think we're about running out of time. So I have one more question. I mean, I have many questions, but just one more question for this occasion. And it's, what are your thoughts on what is happening in Bolivia in art history vis-a-vis other places like the UK? The UK was described as in the flyer of this event as a cool, buzzy, highly political subjects, filling pages of social media and even primetime slots on TV. We know that's not the case, but how far or close are we from this scenario, or are we still a bunch or a short number of specialists of an arcane subject? What do you think?
It could be read as a very sad history, because the main, the greatest persons in the Bolivian art history are Jose de Mesa and Teresa Gisbert, indeed, and together with Mario Chacon in the same generation. There are others that started the history of art, like Armando Alba, Rigoberto Villarroel Claure, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the 20th century. In those years, the first years, the history was a very linear history. It was the rediscovery of the art hispanoamericano, as they called them, a subsidiary of art of the Spanish art in the colonial period. But later, the studies by Mesa and Gisbert opened the mind and the field to other approaches, and they devoted the name, they established the name colonial art. They established the name of the classification of mestizo art. Nobody is, not all people agree with those terms, but they are there. Today, in fact, the sad part of the history is that there is not any career, university career, preparing art historians in Bolivia. Mesa and his bird were taught art history in Spain with Marco Dorto, with Diego Angulo and other teachers, great masters. I learned from them also in Spain. But when they started to teach art history in Bolivia, they were so complex, and when there was a revolution in the university in 1917, the people erased all the art histories in the university to prevent from Mesas to come back to university. That's crazy, that's stupid, but that's what happened. I was in that field also, so I was kind of a victim of the situation. Nobody was interested in Bolivian art history in those decades. So there is no any career in it, and there is only two careers of history in Bolivia, one in La Paz and one in Sucre. And there is no art history subject in those careers. Nobody learns art history in those careers. Only in some architecture faculties in Santa Cruz, Cochabamba, La Paz, art history of architecture is taught. So nobody is studying or running a career or doing a career in art history in Bolivia. People study art history just like me, by vocation, by interest, and you must study those subjects abroad. You could study in Chile, in Peru, and in Argentina, in Spain, everywhere else but Bolivia. So that's a terrible situation, because there is no interest, there is no chance for people to study. I know that there is some young people that are studying art history or have studied art history in Bolivia, that work in Bolivia, but they are not teaching or researching art history in Bolivia. They are doing everything else but art history. That's the situation. And as for the optics in which the art history is being made, well, subjects have changed from the 70s to the present. Some people is studying, like, not making any general views anymore or linear views anymore, but studying subjects, transversal subjects, multidisciplinary projects together with anthropologists. And there is some people that came from abroad or of other fields, like theologists or anthropologists or archaeologists, that immerse themselves in Bolivian art history. There are two young people, only you and my daughter Lucia, you know, that have degrees, doctorate degrees in art history that are dealing with Bolivia. You in contemporary and modern art, my daughter in colonial art. She loves colonial art. I guess she inherited from me that feeling, that approach, that love for colonial art. And her thesis is on the paintings and the church of Cachiaviri in the Altiplano near the border with Chile. So you in the contemporary and modern art, and Lucia in the colonial art. She's now working in a project on research on the saints and colonial art in the 17th century. There is some people working in Mexico, but most of the researchers are from abroad, from Chile, from Argentina, like Gabriela Siracusano, Marta Peños, Agustina Ramirez, or from the US, like Ilona Katsu, Ananda Cohen, Emily Floyd, Amerio from Italy, some people from Germany, Astrid Windus from Germany, that are looking for or studying colonial Bolivian art or contemporary art, but it's made from abroad. No, there's no way to study here art history, and that's quite sad.
Okay, thank you so much, Pedro, for sharing your experiences and views on Bolivian art history and its current situation. We have a few minutes for to answer. There is one question from Douglas Rodrigo Rada, and maybe another one. Douglas Rodrigo Rada asks, Pedro, what's your opinion of contemporary Bolivian art and how do you relate it with 20th century art?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, because the point is that contemporary art is happening now. So it's quite difficult to make an art history of something that's happening. That's the role of the critic. And as there is no critic of art in Bolivia also, neither. So art critics should register and select what's important, or see the contemporary art from other views, from different views or different angles, from different approaches. And the link with the art of the 20th century is natural, because it's a kind of an evolution. You might see there are trends that remain the same. Even the contemporary artists in Bolivia are dealing with the things that matter to the soul of the Bolivians in the Andean regions of the lower lands also. So the link is there. The question is doing that, registering and the analysis of that art. That's the role of critics. I did that for a while. I decided not to do anymore.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo, for this question. Rodrigo is a curator at Kiosco Art Residency and Gallery in Santa Cruz. I wonder if maybe some of the members or of Anglo-Bolivian Society have some questions or comments at this point, if there are no further comments from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Valeria and Pedro. Excellent conversation. We learned quite a lot. First, I have here Winston, who is going to make a question, but I remind everybody who are here at the webinar, you can raise your hands or use the Q&A button to send your questions. So if you raise your hand, I will give you your mic and you can have the conversation straight forward with Pedro and Valeria. And the Q&A, I'm going to read the questions to whoever wants to do it. So Winston, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Amazing presentation. I have, you made one reference to Gunnar Mendoza. You're from Chuquisaca, you're from Sucre. You made one reference to Gunnar Mendoza, but also the importance. I just wanted to ask you about the work that Gunnar Mendoza did in ordering that Archivo and Biblioteca Nacional, which is very, very important. I imagine it was a reference for you and for your work, but I'd just like to gain some understanding of how much of a reference that the Biblioteca y Archivo Nacional was for you and for the people, and also just to get an idea of those successors of Gunnar Mendoza, if you work with them like Josep Barnadas, for example, or René Arce Aguirre, and of course, Marcela Inch. Could you just give me just a little roundup, just an explanation, and how important that archive has been and that library has been for your work?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for making the point. I mentioned Gunnar Mendoza because he ordered the archives, and he make features, cardex of any documents. So when Jose de Mesa and Teresa Gilbert went to Sucre, and those cardex were open to any researchers to be used. The same thing was made in Potosí by Mario Chaco Torres, who ordered the archives in La Moneda, and found a lot of information on artists and architects and goldsmiths and the like, and Luis Niño, for example. So that part of document is quite important, and for me in my job of as art historian is what it was quite helpful. I have to mention my wife, because I learned from her how to write and how to be rigorous with the information. But at the same time, she gave me a lot of documents, like, for example, there is a document in which the sculptor requests in his contract some kind of cloth. And the cloth is registered in the contract, but there is no explanation what for. When you see the piece, it's a hollow piece, it's made on cloth. It's a sculpture made on cloth in 1580. The same thing was another document that mentioned in the contract that the painter requested some cueros, sheep leathers. What for? He needed, it was not to cover himself with cueros, it was to make glue. So artists made their own materials. He prepared the skins, the lamb skins, to extract the glue, a soft glue, to make the paintings. And documents are scarce and teardrops of information, and reading of those information is what helps us to contract and helped me to write those articles on and techniques of the artists. I read Pacheco, Chenini, Leonardo's books on techniques, but one is the theory, another one is finding the piece made according to those techniques, and in the contract finding the information. That was awesome. For example, in a document says Azul de Castilla. There is no Castilla blue, but it was mentioned in several documents, and that meant that it was lapis lazuli blue, what we know as ultramarine blue, but that was made from lapis lazuli that was brought from Persia to Spain, and to America was brought as from Spain, from Castilla. So Azul de Castilla was a very expensive color because what was lapis lazuli, it was imported from Persia. The painters had to manage to get another type of blues in the colonial Andean region. But those drops of information are quite valuable, and those become from archives that are also linked together with lab research, like those made by Alicia Seldes. I tried to implement those projects according to follow up my researches, but Alicia Seldes published 5 books on the colors used by painters in colonial painting in Buenos Aires. Those are huge sources of information to understand the colonial art. It was not the idea, the engraving, it was not only the creation of a theme or the use of a print made in Antwerp. It was also who was doing those pieces, the Indians, the mestizos, some Europeans, and how they made it. It is part of the documents, and that's something that, as nobody is very few people is studying colonial art or colonial history in Bolivia. It's a void, in fact, in the knowledge of contemporary studies on art history today.
Thank you, Pedro. We have a question from Juan Enrique Montes, a friend and colleague from London, and also the son of Fernando Montes, whose painting we see to your right. And the question is, thank you for a fascinating discussion and for your contribution to the art history of Bolivia. A recent director of the National Museum of Art declared that he would decolonize the museum. What does decolonization mean in practice, and what is your view of this concept?
Well, decolonization is an ideology that is running around the whole America and some other places also, some other continents also. It, in theory, means that we should decolonize our thought from the Eurocentric or way of thinking. In other words, we should decolonize knowledge from the Western Occidental line of thought and revitalize or rediscover the pre-Hispanic or the traditional thought or way of thinking. And in a way, it's a very valid issue. Any knowledge in a human history is very important. And it's true that the Western world has dominated the thought on the way of making history. They're making researches, they make science, they're making culture and making politics. But the problem is translating that theory or that ideology to the practice. The most common result is that in fact, they are denying the colonial period as a period of colonization, not taking into account the great contribution of the Indians during the colonial period and the Mestizo people during the colonial period. We cannot understand colonial people art without the work of the great deal of Indians like Ruiz Niño or Mestizos, supposedly like Melchor Pérez Holguín, that were part of this culture. The Andean region had a different culture in Bolivia, in Peru, in Chile, different from Italy, from Spain, from France, in the same period. So there were a different reality. But the great mistake they are doing based on that ideology is that they are just erasing the past. And that in the end is kind of the use of the Trotsky ideology to destroy everything, but to start building from zero. And I think that the history of mankind has demonstrated very clearly that that's not possible. We always construct anything from what was before us, no matter if it was destroyed. That's the point. I hope it's an answer.
Thank you, Pedro. We have Jose Arispe from Sao Paulo who has written the following question. Who is responsible of the weak interest in art history and weak art institutions in Bolivia? The state, intellectuals, or corporations?
Both, everybody. The state, there's no cultural policies on history, on art history, or on culture, or in art, or on art. Intellectuals from the leftist way of thinking don't understand what happened in the colonial period, so don't understand the reality today. They are based on slogans made abroad and trying to implement those in Bolivia. And corporations are just greedy and they want profit and they don't think of anything but profit. In this case, it's very sad because just for denying the way to Jose de Mesa and Teresa Gisbert and people and other people, including me, they are denying the knowledge of the country itself.
Thank you, Pedro. If you want to do more questions, you can use the Q&A or you can raise your hand. I have here a comment from Sergio Bretel, who says the conditions of the entire context of art in Bolivia has forced the creation of an art that can be called in a certain way a peripheral to the establishment of art world. What was your view?
I didn't quite understand the question. It's very complicated. Could you read it
Yes.
again?
The conditions of the entire context of art in Bolivia has forced the creation of an art that can be called in a certain way a peripheral to the establishment of art world. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's a permanent discussion of if we are the center of anything or periphery of some other thing. If you see from the International View of Art, in which if you consider the main points, Paris or New York or London or whatever, we are in the periphery. So as we are not as a country, as a government, as an intellectual world, trying to put something as an own center, we still are periphery, including of ourselves.
Thank you, Pedro. I think, well, we are all now a little bit more than 2 hours, almost 2 hours with these magnificent conversations with you and Valeria. I really thank you about that. And I would like to give Kate and Winston now the platform so they can close this magnificent webinar, which is incredible, but normally after 2 hours, almost all the attendees normally left the webinars. In that case, I can say that we have 90% of them still here listening to you. So Kate and Winston, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Alberto.
Your mic is off.
Yeah, now my mic is on. I just want to say the most enormous thank you. I think that was the most thrilling 2 hours. I have 7 pages of notes. It was wonderful. Thank you very, very much indeed, both of you. It was a lot of work to put something like that together, and it was of enormous interest. And I feel we've been at a completely unique event. And thank you very much indeed. So grateful.
I thank you, Kate, for putting some questions, and especially Valeria to put in so many questions to be answered in this chat, in this discussion. Well, it was quite interesting for me, expressing my thoughts to answer and explain everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winston.
Thank you.
Well, I would also like to thank you very much, Professor Pedro Querejazu and Dr. Valeria Paz, for this excellent and now memorable presentation. And we would like to now ask everybody for a round of applause as an expression of thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Valeria. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Winston.
Thank you.
On the contrary, thank you to you, Pedro and Valeria. And just a reminder to everybody, we are going to have this presentation on our website very soon. And as always, we are going to also to share this to all those who attend the webinar. Thank you very much, and until the next time.